Okay, I think I'm going to make a start in the interest of time. Welcome everybody, and thank you for attending. My name is Zita Holbourne. I'm one of the National Vice Presidents of PCS, and I also chair the PCS National Women's Forum and elected to the TUC Women's Committee. And I'll come on after I cover the domestics to introduce our speakers today. We're going to be recording this meeting, so if you don't want to have your face showing in the recording, I would recommend that you switch off your camera now. And you can do that by pressing stop video in the bottom left hand corner of your screen. If you can't see it, if you hover your mouse around it will pop up. And we'd ask everybody, and I can see everybody's already muted, to stay on mute unless you're speaking. And what we'll be doing is to load this onto YouTube, so that people will be able to watch it and you'll be able to share it with colleagues if you want to after the event. We'll be taking some questions. You will all know, if you registered, that you were invited to submit questions in advance. So we'll take those questions after we've heard from our two speakers. And we will also take questions from anybody who'd like to ask a question today, so you don't have to have submitted a question in advance. And if you prefer to put your question into the chat, then you can do that. And I'm hoping that time will permit us to have sort of 2 rounds of questions and answers from the panel. So the reason we've called this meeting on women and the impacts of COVID is because we know that COVID has had particular impacts on women as workers, but also some disproportionate impacts. So we know that domestic abuse has increased during the lockdown period and the pandemic. We also know that women are the primary carers. So when it's come to having to care for vulnerable family members or members in the community, maybe elderly relatives or disabled relatives as well as children, that responsibility largely falls to women to conduct that. And of course with lockdown it's become even harder because people are isolated in their own homes and people are trying to juggle also childcare and also having to educate and school children at home, which has been quite difficult. There's also evidence come through that men have a better setup for working from home and better workstation than women, and women are the ones that don't have the sort of office space and are having to make do with whatever they can put together, you know, laptops perched on the lap or at the table or however they can manage. So there are a host of different issues, and I don't intend to go through all of those issues now because of course we have our wonderful speakers who are going to talk about not only the issues but what we've been doing both in PCS and the wider trade union movement to raise these issues, to negotiate with employers. We've been having regular meetings with the Cabinet Office, but we've also been having regular meetings within our own employer bargaining areas and negotiating around these issues. There's been a host of guidance that has been put out nationally and in groups, but it may be that you haven't all seen that information. And there's lots of work that's been carried out at the TUC level, and you'll be hearing about what's been happening at that level across the sort of employment sector. So I'll introduce our speakers now, and we have 2 fantastic women with us who are going to be sharing with you some of the things that we've been doing. Hopefully Fran Heathcote will be known by most of you here. Fran was elected as National President for the first time in 2019, having been Deputy President since 2018 and Acting President since November before that. Fran was DWP president from 2012 to 2019, and before that DWP organiser for many years. Fran lives in the Northeast, where she is still the regional chair and is a keen anti-austerity activist who leads the PCS campaign for a decent social security system for those who need it. Passionate about organising and increasing participation, Fran has previously taken responsibility within the NEC for the Young Members Network and the Disabled Members Network, and is always keen to hear new ideas about how we can improve representation and membership engagement within PCS. And we also have with us Sian Elliott. Sian is the TUC Women's Equality Officer. She works in the Equalities and Strategy Department at the TUC, focusing on women's rights and equality in the workplace. Sian works on policy issues such as sexual harassment, representation of women in unions, occupational segregation, women in the labour market, equal pay, sex discrimination and maternity rights. So what we want to do at this meeting is to share with you some of the things that we've been involved in and what we've been doing to represent women's issues, but also to hear from you what your concerns are, and look at what things do we need to prioritise and take forward after this meeting on behalf of women, because I've talked about some of the things that have been impacting us during lockdown from the coronavirus pandemic. But of course, there are also some women members who are will be at risk. And one of the things we've been doing is negotiating with the employer around those who are high risk and highly vulnerable and what protections should be in place. And I've been involved in those negotiations, as have Fran. And also we know that we're hitting a really awful economic impact. And we've already been through over 10 years of austerity, and we know going forward that whenever there is an economic crisis, there are cuts, that it is those from equality groups who are adversely and disproportionately impacted, and that will include women. And of course, as women, we are intersectional, so there may be multiple impacts on us. So that will have to be, something we focus on going forward, because there are going to be huge impacts, including the impacts on particular sectors with large proportions of women working in those sectors who are vulnerable because they're in privatized areas, outsourced workers, or areas in industries who have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And that includes some of our members who are facilities workers, working in civil service departments, those in the culture sector working in museums and galleries. But I'll stop there, and I'm going to hand over to our speakers. So I'd like to invite Fran to speak first, please. Thank you very much, Fran.
Okay, thanks, Zita, and thanks very much for having me along tonight. Obviously, thanks for that warm welcome, and good evening to everybody on the call. If it's okay, I'd just like to talk you through a little bit of what's going on within PCS and obviously wider, and then if you've got any questions, then I'll do my best to answer when it comes to that. So women lead very complex lives, you don't need me to tell you that, and our needs and requirements are varied. As a movement, in the year of the 50th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act, we've made great strides to increase women's participation in the workplace, but COVID-19 has the potential to undo a lot of that. And whilst lots of reports say that more men are dying as a result of COVID-19, the health of women generally is impacted in lots of ways, which includes the reallocation of priorities in resourcing, including sexual and health services. Within PCS, lots of things have changed during the pandemic. Everything about the way we normally do things has had to be reviewed. As a union that's always prided itself on promotion of face-to-face contact with our members, we've had to adapt to a whole new virtual world, and it really has been a baptism of fire in some ways. The NEC is meeting fortnightly, not face-to-face obviously, but by Zoom, something that most of us had never used pre the pandemic, but now we seem very, very familiar with it. Our discussions with the Cabinet Office, as Zita said, are very frequent, at times virtually daily, and the subject list just keeps getting longer. Just yesterday, I cleared a briefing to go out to groups with 16 attachments, 16 new bits of guidance that we're negotiating, with more bits to follow. And just as an illustration of that, overarching HR policy, support and attendance, return to office guidance, school closures, time off and annual leave, managing poor performance and attendance, working from home, dispute resolution and discipline, looking after your well-being and mental health, quarantine principles, return to work conversation principles, death in service, delegated pay and reward, and volunteers and reservists. And then alongside all of that, advice around the job retention scheme and test and trace guidance. The idea being that where we can negotiate good practice, that can be used across departments, but where group negotiators negotiate something that's better than that, we use that as a lever in our negotiations to put pressure on the Cabinet Office to come up with something that is overarching. And if you listen to that list I've just read out, those are all things where women are impacted, and we must spell out to employers that women's needs must be taken fully into account when we're dealing with all of those issues. And as we're seeing a shift in emphasis from the government on getting more civil servants back into the workplace, and we know that that varies a lot between departments, those who already have most people back in work to those who have nearly everybody at home. But the policies that have been negotiated then become really, really important. Although the Cabinet Office claimed there's no pressure to get everybody back into work before it's fully safe to do so, that's completely contradicted by Boris and his cronies saying that they want to boost the economy, get everybody spending again, and reopen the high street. There's a massive shift in government policies around office closures, as some of the biggest departments now need more staff and office space, not less. And if you take the DWP as an example of that, if you remember 2 or 3 years ago, with a massive fanfare, they announced their massive office closure and estate strategy programme, where they shut lots of front-facing job centres and lots of services to the public. Well, now, of course, they're reopening what are described as mothballed offices, offices that they previously closed because they said they didn't need them, that now they recognise with the huge spike in universal credit claims that they're going to need more staff, more office space and more resource. So already we're seeing a complete turnaround there, and that's not that's mirrored in lots of different departments. So Alex Chisholm sent a letter to all departments that spelt out that in less than a week from the date that he wrote the letter, which I think was the 22nd of July, we want every department to give a report of what your plans are and the timescales to get everybody back into the workplace. Now, the Cabinet Office denied that there's any change in emphasis and that our members should stay home and stay safe, but that's contradicted by that diktat that's been sent to departments. One thing is clear, though. The pandemic has shown us that lots of things can be done differently, and that it's our members that provide essential services that keep this country running, many of them designated as key workers. So when this is finally all behind us, with lots of talk of continued austerity across the public sector, we are absolutely clear that there can be no going back and that our members must be recognised. It's not enough to thank everybody with their warm words, to bang pots and pans on a Thursday night in recognition of key workers, but not to recognise us in our pay packet, which is why we've launched our campaign for a decent pay rise above the rate of inflation. So if you take one thing away from this evening, we would urge you, if you haven't done already, to sign the petition, but more than that, to encourage friends, family and colleagues, people that you speak to sign the petition as well. They don't need to be PCS members. They do need to believe that we need proper investment in the public sector, and we need our members recognised in their pay packet. So we would urge you to encourage everybody to sign that petition. There can be no division between those in the workplace and those at home. The policies being negotiated must be to the benefit of both groups, and obviously the only people that benefit if we set groups of workers against each other are those that are trying to worsen their conditions. So many members have shown how well their jobs can be done remotely. And in places like the HMRC in Ealing, where we've had a fantastic campaign to try and keep the tax office open, and where many members face redundancy because they cannot get to another workplace within daily travel, some due to care and responsibilities and issues that mean that they can't just make that journey to another workplace. We have shown that other ways of working are possible, and there are other possibilities to keep people in a job. So we have to ensure that all of that is fully explored in terms of what the government and what the HMRC in this instance do next. And we know that working from home has been good for some people, but for others not so much. Some women would have really loved to work from home, but were prevented from doing so. Some had caring responsibilities, some were shielding or living with somebody that was shielding. Some women working from home really want to be back in the workplace, and for good reason. If we look at the issue of domestic violence, as the pandemic deepened, economic and social stresses, coupled with restricted movement and social isolation measures, saw a massive increase in gender-based violence. Being forced to lock down with your abuser at the same time as support services are restricted or unavailable is a massive issue. Refuge, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, has had a tenfold increase in visits to its website, and 2/3 of survivors responding to a Women's Aid survey back in April said that violence had escalated under lockdown. So clearly these are big issues. The money the government had offered to support the vulnerable is 67 million, which sounds like a huge amount of money until you realise that Women's Aid estimate they require 393 million per year just in England alone. This has been a challenging time for all of us. Regardless of individual circumstances, there are many of us that just miss the ability to interact with colleagues face to face at the end of a stressful day. Covid-19 has had a real impact on mental health as well as physical well-being. For some of us, there have been some positives. I've become an avid cyclist and taken on a big cycling challenge in aid of Alzheimer's research, something I could never normally have done, spending most of my time away from home on PCS business. But I have friends saying to me, I piled the pounds on, I feel terrible, I do nothing but eat. Every one of us has been impacted by a year and a set of circumstances that none of us could possibly have predicted. But what has really come across during this time is the importance of being in a union and how much support, help and guidance PCS offers its members. We have seen a climb in membership, an increase in people wanting to get involved in PCS. We've had to adapt our ways of working to a more digital approach, and that can be a big shift for a lot of people. But because we've been very proactive in contacting reps and then in turn contacting members at the start of the pandemic, lots of people came forward and said they'd like to be involved in some way. And for many, often those with responsibilities outside the workplace, seeing that you could do these things remotely allowed them to participate in a way that they wouldn't normally have been able to do. And I want to finish on that really. Sometimes as women, we're not very good at pushing ourselves forward, at speaking up when somebody else has made the point that we would have made if we'd spoken. But sometimes we don't get involved because we just can't, because the responsibilities we have on top of being at work are just too great. But we've all learned from the pandemic that there are lots of ways we can participate and that everybody can play a part. Not everybody wants to spend hours travelling on trains. Not everybody wants to devote their life to socialism. But actually, just by being the contact point, the advocate for the people that you work with and that you sit with or that you speak to on the phone, you can play a really vital part in PCS. Nobody knows your colleagues better than you do. Our members or our potential members who haven't taken the step to join PCS yet will respond far better to somebody they know and trust. So it's far better to have lots of members playing a part in PCS than one or two people doing everything. Think back to how I first got involved in what was CPSA then, as a relatively young employee of the benefits agency, and we held a members meeting, the first members meeting I'd ever been to decide who our rep was going to be. We still had the old Whitley system, and they wanted somebody to go along on behalf of our office to the Whitley meetings. And somebody pointed at me and said, "She's young and gobby, she'll go." And whilst I'm not perhaps quite so young these days, I'm certainly probably still as gobby. And just that wish to see fairness in the workplace, to see justice for everybody, and for everybody to have a voice was all that it really needed to get more involved in CPSA and then PCS. Eventually, I got onto the Group Executive Committee, and I didn't say much to begin with. There were lots of powerful speakers. It was a very male-dominated committee at that time. What could I possibly add to what they'd already had to say? But eventually, I gained a bit of confidence and spoke up and realised that my opinion was just as valid as those as the other speakers. And of course, once you get started, speaking up was something that I did a lot more of. And we have to ensure that our women have a voice and have a say in every decision that PCS makes. We owe it to ourselves, but we also owe it to the women around us. And I see my role as president in ensuring that equality really is at the heart of everything we do, and that everybody has a voice. And we want to know what you think. We won't always agree on everything, but that's fine. Only by talking things through and hearing everybody's ideas will we reach the best decisions. So I hope you get a lot out of this evening. It's part of an ongoing dialogue about shaping our union, about increasing participation, and about giving everybody a voice. And if you have ideas about things, put them in, because nobody has the monopoly on good ideas, and we need members to be engaged in what we're doing and to be sure that when we do make decisions that we're making the right decisions that people have had an opportunity to input into. We're facing a very difficult period ahead. We've got a hostile government already generating discussions about who pays for the crisis. As Zita said, we've had a number of years of austerity, and we're very clear there can be no return to austerity. But in order to bring that about, we have to be sure that we stand together. A crisis that we face now that none of us know the outcome of or how long it's going to continue. We will get through it, but we'll get through it with our collective strength, and we as women have a big role to play in supporting each other. Our job, every single one of us on this call, is to pull together, to support each other, and not allow the government to set groups of workers against each other, because we really are stronger when we act together. So I send you my solidarity. I thank you very much for listening, and obviously happy to take any questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Fran, for that overview of what we've been doing and what's been happening. And it's true that even though we've been in a virtual world, we've actually been really, really busy, if not busier than we usually are. And our National Women's Forum has also been meeting by Zoom during lockdown. And we have also, Fran talked about domestic abuse and the impacts of domestic abuse, and one of the things we've been doing is providing the Bright Sky app training, which is an app that women can download on their phone and get assistance and support if they are experiencing domestic abuse. But it's also an app that can be used by people who are supporting women who are impacted. So some of us have been doing that training. I've done the training. I have the app on my phone, and we've put out some guidance on the impacts of domestic abuse and what people can do and where they can turn to for help. And so has the TUC as well as PCS, but I'm sure Sian will speak to us about that. So also, just to mention before I bring Sian in, if you think of any questions as we're going along, or any comments, do put them in the chat box. You don't have to wait till later on to do that. You can do that at any time. And also, you might have noticed that sometimes the view that you're getting of the Zoom meeting is changing. What we're doing is we're recording in speaker view because it's better for the YouTube afterwards. But you can always change that back. And if you don't know how to do that, in the top right-hand corner, you can see the view. So I'm currently, because I'm speaking in speaker view on my screen, so I can change it to gallery view and vice versa. So whatever you prefer, it's obviously optional how you want to view the meeting, but in case you want to see the speakers and you're seeing the whole gallery, you can change it there if you'd like to. It gives me great pleasure now to welcome Sian. I'm fortunate that I work alongside both Fran on a regular basis and also alongside Sian in my role on the TUC Women's Committee, and in fact the TUC Women's Conference was the sort of last main conference that happened before lockdown hit the whole of the UK, our countries and nations, and that was the last time I think I saw you physically, Sian. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us your time this evening, Sian. Welcome. You're on mute. Oh.
Thank you very much, Zita. Thank you for that kind introduction. And it actually was really lovely to have that last opportunity of sisters coming together in solidarity before we went into lockdown. I didn't realise how much we would need that solidarity and that moment of coming together. And for any of you that have been to TUC's annual Women's Conference, you'll know it's such a celebration of all we achieve as women within our movement and at work, but it's also something that we can take real strength from. As Zita said, I'm the Women's Equality Officer at the TUC. I just want to say a huge thank you to PCS and to Fran and the Women's Committee for inviting me along here this evening, and also to Diane, Caroline and Melissa for their support behind the scenes, and for our interpreter. If I need to slow down, please do let me know, anybody. As Fran said earlier, promoting equality and ensuring everybody has a voice at work is central to what the TUC and all trade unions do, whether that's fighting for equal pay, challenging sexism or racism at work, or empowering women to not only join but to lead our movement and ensure that our voices are heard at work. And never has that work been more important than now, because as we know, there has not been an equal impact from coronavirus. The pandemic has shone a stark light on the deep and persistent structural inequalities that women face across our country. Women have been disproportionately affected by the health and economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. And in particular, women with multiple protected characteristics, Black and ethnic minority women, disabled women, LBT women, and those from low-income households or who are in insecure work, and in particular, pregnant women and migrant women with no recourse to public funds. During the pandemic, structural racism has been a matter of life and death for Black and ethnic minority women. Black workers have seen some of the UK's highest corona death rates. Black women are literally dying on the job. And we've got a report by that name from a call for evidence that we did in June. And I can pop the link in the chat box to that, but I think Diane may also have the link, so may be able to do that for you. Thank you, Diane, I've seen it pop up. But that talks about the systemic inequalities that Black women workers are facing in the workplace that mean they are overrepresented in lower paid, insecure jobs that put them at higher risk of contracting coronavirus during the crisis. Systematic and institutional racism also meant that Black women face poorer health, poorer housing and educational outcomes. And these inequalities have been compounded by the discrimination, sexism and racism that Black women face within our workplaces and across society. As I mentioned in June, we issued a call for evidence from Black workers because we felt that in much of the public discourse around fatality rates of BME workers, the voices of Black workers was missing, particularly Black women. And Black women in that call for evidence told us that they have been singled out for higher risk work, denied access to PPE, to personal protective equipment, to appropriate risk assessments, that they've been unfairly selected for redundancy and furlough, and faced hostility from their managers when they've raised concerns. And the situation was particularly stark for Black female agency workers and those without permanent contracts, who have been exploited through threats to cancel work or reduce hours. And that's been used as a tool by employer to silence them, but also to force them into higher risk situations. And I wanted to share the story of one nurse that told us that she's always allocated to work with the patients who have contracted or suspected of having coronavirus. And she said that was something that didn't happen to her white colleagues. When she asked if staff could be rotated so that no one person was always looking after coronavirus patients, her manager exploited her insecure status as an agency worker, threatening to inform her agency and stop booking her for work. She was then faced with a stark choice about being able to earn an income
and continuing to be placed at increased risk that presented a threat to her life. And this nurse told us that she felt this experience typified the racism, sexism and injustice that she had faced on a daily basis in her workplace throughout her career. And she told us that in the past it had actually caused her to leave a permanent senior role. For migrant women with no recourse to public funds, the stakes have also been incredibly high. Because they are barred from accessing the social security system that other workers are entitled to, they are at the mercy of their employer, who knows that no work means no pay, and most women cannot afford to do that. So for many women working on the front line of this crisis, in our hospitals, in our schools, in our shops, there has been little choice at times between risking their health and the necessity to earn an income. The burden of unpaid care is also costing women their jobs and pay. The continuing underfunding of our care services has had a disproportionate impact on women. Of the UK's 9.8 million key workers who have kept the healthcare system and our country moving as the pandemic hit, it's been women, nearly 2/3 of them are women, who've been on the front line. And they've been putting their lives on the line to care for others, but been left on poverty pay with insecure work. And discrimination has left many female key workers at disproportionately high risk of exposure to Covid-19. They've been working without proper fitting personal protective equipment, or in some cases, no access to PPE at all. And if PPE is ill-fitting or not even there, it cannot do its job and protect women while they are at work. To put it simply, protecting others' lives has cost some women their own. And safety at work needs to urgently be addressed. Thanks to union lobbying, the government's safe working guidance at least references the Equality Act, and in particular BME workers and pregnant women. Prior to our intervention, it didn't mention either of those groups and the higher risk that they face. But far more is needed. We're saying that it must be mandatory for all employers to publish their Covid-19 risk assessments, and for all assessments to take full account of how to ensure those with protected characteristics can work safely. Women have also faced a disproportionate burden of unpaid care during the crisis. As necessary measures taken to prevent the spread of coronavirus led to schools and childcare providers being closed, it was women who were left to juggle paid and unpaid work, with mums providing around 2/3 more childcare a day than dads. Unions called for and won an extension of the furlough scheme for those with caring commitments, and that helped secure the incomes of mums and some dads while they tried to balance work and care. But the lack of a part-time option meant that many mums were forced out of the workplace and back into the home on a full-time basis. Had a part-time furlough option been introduced, as unions lobbied for, mums and dads could have shared care more easily, having a less damaging impact on women's jobs. Likewise, when social care services were closed, millions were asked to shield at home, it was women who were left to fill the unpaid care gap. And we know this has really hit older women workers in particular, who often have a double care burden of caring for elderly relatives and partners, as well as grandchildren. And that they appear to have been particularly badly affected. New statistics released yesterday suggest that women over 50 have seen the largest rise in economic inactivity since the crisis began, with many older women workers forced into early retirement in order to provide care. Women in this age group were already had a pension pot around 30% lower than men of the same age, because they were the ones who had to take time out earlier in their career to care. And they are much more likely to live in poverty as pensioners than men. Forced early retirement, frankly, worsens their economic security now and in their older years. And the TUC and our unions are lobbying hard to stop this. We're making the case that a lack of government investment in good public sector jobs, in flexible working, and in particular in the social care sector, is holding back women and holding our recovery back. We're also really concerned that we're seeing a reversal of decades of progress towards gender equality at work. As many as 1 in 3 employers are set to make redundancies, according to the CIPD. And the TUC are really concerned that some groups of women are at even higher risk of redundancy. We know that disabled women, LBT women, BME women and pregnant workers all face higher rates of discrimination in terms of redundancy decisions. 54,000 women a year are forced out of work due to pregnancy and maternity discrimination, and that was based on statistics during a stable economy. We're concerned that with a worsening economy, as employers seek to cut corners and cut costs, pregnant women are going to be losing their jobs. We did a survey in June with over 3,400 new and expectant mums about their experiences at work during the COVID crisis. And 1 in 4 pregnant women told us that they had been unfairly treated or discriminated against at work since the crisis began. This included being singled out for furloughing, being singled out for redundancy, or simply being denied hours if they were 0 hours contract workers. We also found widespread flouting of the law by employers that our unions have been working hard to challenge. Nearly half of the pregnant women that we spoke to had not had a risk assessment carried out since the crisis began. And of those that had, 46% said their employer had not taken the necessary steps to remove or reduce the risks identified in that risk assessment, or to adjust their working conditions, or to suspend them, as is their right under health and safety law. Quite frankly, employers are breaking the law. We found that employers instead were wrongly forcing pregnant women to take sick leave, unpaid leave, annual leave, or to start their maternity leave early. And this is an issue that disproportionately affects women on low pay. They were nearly twice as likely to say they had been forced out of their job as pregnant women on medium to high incomes. And the situation looked particularly precarious for pregnant women in insecure forms of work on things like 0 hours contracts or agency contracts, who miss out on many of the basic rights and protections that securely employed pregnant workers get, such as the right to sick pay, the right to time off for emergencies, and protection from unfair dismissal, protections that are vital during a crisis like this. And this gaping hole in employment protection has created an impossible choice for pregnant women during the crisis. Do they continue with work with the health risks presented to themselves and their unborn baby, or do they stop work but lose all of their income? For many low-paid women, going without income is simply not an option, so they have to take the risks. Existing inequalities have also been compounded for disabled women. Even before the Covid-19 crisis, benefit cuts and austerity were hitting disabled women the hardest. Changes to the welfare system over the past 10 years has left disabled adults 4 times worse off financially than non-disabled adults. And as the economic fallout of the pandemic hits, disabled women look set to face some of the highest rates of unemployment, with many being unlawfully targeted for redundancy or to have their working conditions changed that mean they are no longer able to work. Disabled women who have been asked to shield have been particularly badly let down by government, with many now at risk of losing their jobs and livelihoods, as they cannot return safely to work, even though we're all being encouraged to do so, but have been denied continued access to the job retention scheme that provided a vital way of protecting their incomes during this crisis. So we at the TUC and our unions are calling for an extension of the job retention scheme for these workers, and also for those with caring responsibilities beyond October. LBT women have also told us that they're facing increased hostility and isolation. Often they've been isolated from support networks and specialist services. Some LBT women have told us that they've endured lockdown periods with hostile and discriminatory family members, as they've had nowhere else to go. And LBT workers have also reported experiencing high levels of hostility and abuse when they've been working on the front line during the pandemic. Women and LBT workers have also faced increased risks of domestic abuse over the lockdown period. And as Fran was saying earlier, domestic abuse has soared since the crisis started. For many women, the workplace became the home and the home became the workplace. They were suddenly isolated at home in order to contain the spread of the virus. cut off from their family, from their friends, from colleagues, from the benefit of leaving a home where they're at risk of domestic abuse and going to the sanctuary of a workplace where they can actually have some respite. And they've been instead isolated with their abuser. The UN have said that on a global scale, domestic abuse has increased by at least 20%. And in the UK, the National Domestic Abuse Helpline reported a 47% increase in calls and a 150% increase in visits to their websites. And that difference tells you that women aren't able to get through to them, pick up the phone and talk to people because they're isolating in a home with an abuser where it isn't safe to talk out loud to support services. And that's where many of our reps have led the way, by talking through other means, by recommending the Bright Sky app that Zita mentioned, that's absolutely brilliant. It disguises itself on the phone as something innocuous so that if a perpetrator takes a woman's phone, they don't know what it is. But also we've heard about reps checking in with their members in very coded, subtle language through WhatsApp and through emails, because that's a legitimate way that women who are experiencing domestic abuse, coercive control, can still be making contact with the outside world. Reps have also led the way in the workplace, negotiating with employers who are suddenly waking up that this is not only a trade union issue, this isn't a private issue, domestic abuse is a workplace issue. And they've been demanding that employers introduce domestic abuse policies, stating what they're going to do to support employees and also to create workplace practices and cultures that are inclusive and let those at risk of or experiencing domestic abuse know that it's safe for them to disclose this to their employer, to their line manager, or to their workplace rep. In response to the needs of reps, as Zita mentioned, we at the TUC produced a free online tool designed to help reps spot signs of domestic abuse, to support members, and to help stop it from happening. We worked with Women's Aid and the End Violence Against Women and Girls Coalition on that, and it's free to access for reps, for line managers, for anybody who's interested. And I think Diane has already posted the link. Thank you, Diane. We're now lobbying for employers to be mandated to provide support to workers by providing training for all staff, but particularly for line managers, by providing a workplace policy and providing 10 days paid leave to all domestic abuse survivors. And we're working with our unions to lobby for changes to the domestic abuse bill to make that a reality. So to finish, as Fran said, this crisis has shown how vital unions are for women workers. The pandemic has laid bare the scale of the structural inequality that we face, and the case for change is stronger than ever. The government's woeful response has failed to promote equality and actually has gone so far as to undermine it. And we're worried that we're really going to see a reversal of decades of progress of gender equality if we don't stand against it. And that's what unions are going to do. We know that a fairer and equal economy will mean a stronger economy. By organising with our sisters on the ground, by hearing from you sisters out there in the workplace, forcing government to hear our needs and to act on them, we can ensure that we build back better and secure women's equality in the workplace. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sian, for that overview, and it just shows the vast range of issues that we're facing as women and will continue to face, and the work that we've been doing across the trade union movement, both in PCS and more widely across every union and at TUC level, to raise these issues. I've seen some comments come through in the chat and one question. What I'm going to do to start with is to read out some of the questions we received in advance. So thank everybody who submitted questions, that's really appreciated. Take a few of the questions that I have from the advanced set of questions, and a couple of the comments and questions in the chat, come back to our panel and then take another set, and then I'll see if anybody wants to come in and ask a question or make a comment themselves rather than just in the chat. So here's some of the questions we received in advance. What policies have PCS, other members, seen from employers which have been useful to women during the pandemic, e.g. around homeschooling, well-being, mental health, shared parental leave? And another question, I work for a non-departmental government body and I struggled with childcare and homeschooling while working from home full-time during lockdown. Has the panel seen effective measures put in place in some organisations and institutions to help with this? Employees with additional caring tasks, for example, and can they share what those measures are? And another question, we need consistency across all employers in actions and changes in response to the pressures put on women of Covid-19, childcare, homeschooling, elder care, and working from home or having to return to working in the workplace. What changes in policy and practice is PCS lobbying for across all of the civil service, NDPBs, and other organisations to help women? And I saw that there was a comment made in the chat about Belly Mujinga. I imagine probably everybody here knows about Belly Mujinga, that she was a rail worker at Victoria Station who was spat at along with her colleague. Subsequently, the person that spat at her said that they had coronavirus, and she subsequently died of coronavirus. But the person was tested after that time and found not to have coronavirus. That doesn't mean, of course, that they didn't have it at the time they spat on her. And obviously that's a really abusive, horrific thing to do to anybody and any worker. You know, intention effectively to give her coronavirus. And there's been a big campaign to support her family seeking justice. And some of you may have seen that on the Black Lives Matter protests, people have had placards calling for justice for Belly Mujinga, and there's been a particular part of it that's been focused on that. And that's another thing that we're seeing, is that there's an increasing amount of abuse you know, towards workers because of the measures that are being put in place, and they're having to follow out those policies, government policies and workplace policies, when dealing with the public, which is totally unacceptable to target employees and workers in that way. And I could see that there's a comment saying that from Laura to everyone, I'm pleased to see PCS joining other unions and organisations such as Pregnant Then Screwed and supporting Maria Miller's bill related to pregnant women at the threat of redundancy. And that's something that the National Women's Forum discussed and felt that that was really important that we got involved in and we participated in. So I'll come back to the panel on that set of questions, and then I'll go to some more questions if that's okay. Some of them were PCS specific and others weren't. So I'll start with you, Fran, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine. I just need to get myself off mute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you know, I think there's some good questions coming up, and clearly, as I said in my spiel, that we are virtually meeting the Cabinet Office daily. That's not to take away anything from departmental negotiations. I'm aware that negotiators and groups are working so hard to deal with sort of a level of detail that isn't necessarily available at the Cabinet Office. So if you like, what we end up doing is negotiating overarching policies, and the specific detail that's relevant to your individual department is negotiated by your departmental and group negotiators, and they're doing a fantastic job right now. I speak to some of them, and they are literally a bit like ourselves in daily negotiations over all of this. I think, you know, if I go back to what I said during my speech, an awful lot of the policies that we're discussing with Cabinet Office have an impact on women, but not just women. As Sian said, there are a number of underrepresented groups that are really suffering during the pandemic, for whom these policies become really, really important. Our biggest issue right now is to keep everybody safe, and if that means keeping them at home in order to do that, then that is our, if you like, our preferred option. But we recognise that there are some departments, some of the bigger departments, where people haven't really been at home at all throughout the pandemic. They've been in the workplace dealing with the issues on the ground, in a way that, we all recognise a lot of these policies become really, really important. So in relation to the questions around what specific policies have been useful in respect of women during the pandemic, I think there's a whole range of them around home working, around school and issues around schools, but also just generally care and responsibilities, because whilst women aren't the only carers, predominantly it's women who take the care and responsibilities, and an awful lot of what we discuss is making sure that the policies that the departments discuss are working for women. So I think if you're concerned about a specific policy that doesn't that isn't being applied properly in your department, or something that's causing you a concern in respect to the way women are being treated in your department, you do need to flag that up. I mean, initially in the first instance via your departmental group, but if that doesn't work, you can always get in touch with us nationally to make sure that we're picking up on all of that. In relation to the NDPBs, again, I think those issues that were outlined in what Zita read out are very common around care and responsibilities during the pandemic, and that is something that we're very conscious of. And I agree with the person that said that we need some sort of consistency across departments, because what we're finding in a lot of places, and even within departments, is there are, you'll know yourself, there are good and bad managers everywhere, and some people have really positive experiences of how well they've been looked after during the pandemic, whilst others are the ones that tend to contact us because their experience is not so positive. And so in terms of what changes we're lobbying for, in the first instance, what we're lobbying for is for the policies that are negotiated to be applied consistently within departments, but also across departments. So where they're further reaching, that they apply to all groups of affected members, and a lot of those issues, a lot of the things we're talking about will be very, very relevant to our women. As I say, I can't really go into specifics, but if you have a concern about any particular policy that you feel isn't being applied consistently or properly in your department, flag it up with us, and we will do our best, if we can't resolve it directly, to put you in touch with somebody at departmental level who can, because our primary aim through all of this is to keep everybody safe. Now, clearly, our preference is to do that from keeping people at home, unless it's safe to go back to work, and unless somebody has expressed a preference for being back in the workplace, and that does happen. We do have people that have said that they really want to be back in the workplace, and our job is to make sure that the policies that are negotiated are applied properly. So I hope, Zita, that's covered a few of the questions, but obviously happy to elaborate if necessary.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would just add that in my area, my employer, what they've done is to say that we just do what we can do during lockdown. So people are homeschooling and they are caring for people, and they need to go out and take meals to elderly relatives, for example, or sort things out for them. And we've got children at home that we've got to care for and school, then we do what we can do, and that's as much as we can do. There's no pressure on us to fulfill our normal working day in the way we would. And in addition, we have messages on our email sign off and on our voicemail that says don't expect things to be as they usually are. You expect to hear disruptions, noises, background noise. We may not answer you as fast as we would in the past because we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and crisis, and that's impacting on us as well. So those kind of things I think are quite practical things that are useful, so there isn't the pressure and expectation on coming from stakeholders and coming from customers. But in reality, I think what happens a lot of the time is the people we're speaking to on the phones, for example, or having meetings with, they're having exactly the same issues. I've seen dogs, cats, babies, everybody, on the meetings, and we all just go with the flow and have to expect that that's how it's going to be. But I think, as Fran has said, if that's not happening in your employment area and you're not getting that support, then it's important that you let us know so we can seek to address that. And what groups are doing is there's a section on the PCS website for each group or employment area, and all the briefings that are going out to members, which hopefully you'll be receiving by email, are also going on there in most cases, in most groups. So you'll be able to look back and see what's been negotiated or what policy is out there and what guidance is out there for your specific employer area. So that can be a useful place to look. Sian, would you like to come in and respond, please? Thank you.
Definitely, thank you. I think I might start with the last question about how do we ensure consistency across employers, because for us at the TUC that starts with workers' rights and all workers having the same rights, whether workers are employed in insecure forms of work or whether they're securely employed. We have a couple of key policies that I think are really relevant to this discussion, and in particular to women's experience at work. I thought it would be useful to flag. So we are calling for a day one right to flexible working for all workers. And what we mean by flexible working means very different things for very different workplaces. For some workers, it can mean having a right to predictable hours and set working patterns so that you can plan your childcare or your caring responsibilities around it. We've spoken to lots of parents that are working in insecure work, and they don't know from one week to the next what hours they're going to be working, and they can't plan their childcare accordingly. But that right to flexible working could also be about working flexibly. And we've seen some great practice from employers in unionised workplaces where they've really supported women with caring responsibilities, whether that's juggling childcare and homeschooling, or whether that's caring for relatives, neighbours, friends, and allowing women to work flexibly, whether that's working slightly earlier in the morning, working slightly later in the afternoon, or working atypical hours to what they usually work. Flexible working can also take the form of working compressed hours, working term time only, but thinking very specifically about the COVID context, it would really help workers to have that day one right to flexible work. At the moment, workers have a right to request flexible working after they've been in a job 26 weeks. But research that we did this time last year found that 1 in 3 workers have those requests for flexible working denied. And employers have been really hesitant in lots of workplaces to implement true flexible working. But what we saw with this crisis was that when there was a business imperative for them to do so, they did it very quickly. They did it overnight. So we know that flexible working can work, and it can make all the difference to women staying in full-time or in paid employment. As mentioned in the chat, we're calling for the law around discrimination to be strengthened in terms of discrimination, particularly in redundancies. So Maria Miller's bill that will extend the period of protection for pregnant women and those on maternity leave to during pregnancy and up to 6 months after they return from maternity leave. And we also are calling for the government to make sure that the public sector equality duty, that employers are complying with it and looking at the equality impact of the decisions that they're making when making redundancies and restructuring decisions. As I mentioned earlier, health and safety has become a massive issue in the workplace. We're calling for mandatory risk assessments and for those to consider take into account particular circumstances of different groups, so pregnant workers, BME workers, and the higher risks that they face.
We're also calling for ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting. These have been calls that we've been making prior to the COVID crisis, but we think they're incredibly important now, because if employers right now know that decisions they make about redundancies now are going to show up next year when they report those ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting, as well as their gender pay gap reporting, and they know that they're going to be shown to have huge gaps for those groups, it could affect some of the decisions that they make. So in terms of some of the individual pockets of best practice and policies that we've seen employers implement because unions have negotiated for them, it is negotiating for employers to do an equal pay audit, to look at the particular issues going on in their workplace for particular groups, and then negotiating for employers to map out redundancy plans against those equal pay audits, and to be thinking, are we making redundant higher groups of women than men? Are we making more mums redundant than any other group? Are we making disabled women and BME women, are they showing up as being more likely to be made redundant? And then looking at that decision-making process again before they start making any redundancies. So we'd really be wanting to see reps trying to negotiate for employers to be doing that. We also want to see employers offering paid leave for carers and for parents. We've been calling for that on a national level, and the government have just consulted on a period of unpaid leave for carers. We think that absolutely needs to be paid, because we know that those most at risk are those on low pay who won't be able to afford to take unpaid leave. And we want to see a period of 10 days paid leave for parents, because even once school begins again in September, NHS track and trace measures means that schools or households could be required to isolate for at least 14 days. So if parents had a period of 10 days paid leave, they would be able to cope with that sudden need and loss of childcare without having to possibly lose their job and lose their household income. I also would implore everybody who's a rep in their workplace to look at their flexible working policy. Is it effective? Has it adapted to this new context? What do members think in their workplace? And is there a means by which you can negotiate with your employer to change that policy, to make sure that it's working for this context, but also working going forward? If there's been increase in flexibility during this context, let's make sure that's embedded now so that women can continue to work flexibly, balance the many different needs and caring responsibilities that they have, and continue to progress and achieve gender equality in the workplace. I think, I've got one more, Zita, if I've got time. Just on a national level, 70% of women, 70% of those that miss out on statutory sick pay are women. And we know that at the start of the crisis, it took you had to have 4 days of consecutive leave in order to be eligible for statutory sick pay. Unions got the government to budge on that, and it became a day one right. Now we need to get the government to scrap the eligibility threshold, because that absolutely penalises women in low paid work. As I said, 70% of the 2 million workers that miss out on statutory sick pay are women. So on a national level, we're lobbying for the government to scrap that eligibility criteria. But within workplaces, we're asking unions to try and negotiate to get their employers to enhance those the statutory sick pay, because it's £95 a week and most workers cannot live on that amount. So if an employer can enhance it, then we know that workers have a better chance of staying out of poverty and not having their household incomes adversely impacted. That's all my answers, Zita, sorry.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go through a group of questions now, or a few groups of questions, and I can see there's a related one in the chat, and then invite people, if they've got any questions that in addition to these questions that I've read out, but on the same themes, so we can group them together. So the first set, there is 2 on domestic abuse. However, I think we've largely answered these already, but there's one aspect of it that speakers may want to come back on, Fran and Sian. Violence against women and girls, cis or transgender, is a real and present threat. What can PCS do to enact real change and ensure the law supports them whilst adequately punishing the perpetrators? And how do we ensure we continue to support female members affected by domestic abuse when they are working from home? And I think we've covered that a bit earlier. Then there's a question on being female and BAME, which I'd like to answer when we come back to that part of it. Is there an increased risk being both BAME and female? What can we reasonably ask for as adjustments to go back into the workplace if we are concerned? Then related to the next question, there's one in the chat, so I'm going to put those together. How will women going through the menopause be helped with COVID-19 as immune systems are affected and not acknowledged generally? And Louise has also raised something on this in the chat and said, I have a query regarding the long-term health issues of COVID-19, the long-term effects. Those who have had COVID-19, it's agreed to have the time off as a communicable disease, i.e. not counting towards sickness triggers, but there is evidence that the disease causes long-term physical damage to lungs, for instance, but also mental health effects. I would like to see some negotiation, if not already done, that subsequent time off as a direct result of COVID-19 does not contribute towards triggers going forward. And there's also a couple of questions that I'm going to group in this section as well on pregnancy and maternity. Is coronavirus a danger to pregnant women, new mums and their babies? We hear of people being made redundant because of the financial impact of COVID-19 on businesses. What protection is there for pregnant and new mothers? And of course, Sian has covered some of this already as well. And just on the last point that you were making in the last section, Sian, we've also launched a campaign in PCS, Dying for Sick Pay, which is about our outsourced workers who obviously have all sorts of not very good terms and conditions, and we've been campaigning and fighting on those issues. Our members have been taking industrial action. But during COVID, we've managed to negotiate for most of those areas that if people were off because of COVID, then they would get sick pay from day one. And our campaign is to call for them to get sick pay on any conditions or illness they have, absence, sickness absence from day one, not just when it's COVID related. So I'd like to just say something on the question of is there an increased risk between both BAME and female? Well, yes, there is. Sian's talked about the adverse disproportionate impact on black workers or BAME workers. And the National Black Members Committee have been doing a lot of work on this. We've had a similar event to this on Zoom on COVID and the disproportionate impact on black workers. We've also had a Facebook Live event, and we've also been discussing and raising this issue at TUC level and the TUC Race Relations Committee, which I also represent PCS on. And there is an adverse disproportionate impact. We knew that there was before there were any reports, because we could see it happening in our communities and our families and networks around us. And of course, we've also just talked about menopause, immune systems because of that, pregnant women. So of course, if you fall into those two categories, then you can be impacted. And I've been involved in negotiations with the Cabinet Office alongside Fran and others, and have been co-leading for PCS the negotiations around a particular tool across the civil service for looking at those who are at high risk, which was initially brought about those discussions because of the disproportionate impact on black workers or BAME workers, as is described. We use the term black in its broadest political sense in PCS to encompass BAME. So we've been negotiating with the Cabinet Office around this tool, and in DWP they have negotiated a tool on this, but not just for black workers, but also anybody who's at high risk. So that could include disabled workers, it could include women and other people in high risk categories. So I'll hand back now to Sian and Fran And I'll do it the other way round. I'll ask Sian first and then Fran.
Oh, sorry, I think I unmuted and muted. Okay, so to take some of those, I think I talked a bit about domestic abuse earlier. So I think the key things I would add are around, when I mentioned earlier that workplaces should have a domestic abuse policy, and I can share some of the work, the briefing that I've prepared on this for MPs around tabling an amendment. One of the things we make very clear in that is that not only should that workplace policy be directed at those who might be at risk of experiencing or who are experiencing domestic abuse, but it should also be directed at those who are at risk of perpetrating domestic abuse. And by that I mean signposting them to support services to help them stop perpetrating domestic abuse. And we direct in our TUC tool that I mentioned earlier, we direct potential perpetrators to the Respect helpline, which is a charity for men who may perpetrate domestic abuse, to receive support to stop them, somebody that they can talk to. So I think in terms of the question around what can we do for perpetrators, I think it would be very clear that that workplace policy has to target them as well as to target those who are at risk of experiencing it. And trade unions and reps, of course, can themselves do some of that. I was at an event on Friday where I was talking about an idea that has come to me very recently, so it's still in its early stages, but I'll be taking it to the TUC Women's Committee, but which is about the idea of workplace champions on domestic abuse. And actually new reps coming forward to fulfill a role of a workplace champion, where they have a poster, where they make members in their workplace aware that they are trained in how to respond to disclosures of domestic abuse or to those who might say that they're at risk of perpetrating it. And so I think it's something that we within the trade union movement can also take action on and raise awareness on, as well as lobbying and negotiating for employers to have specific workplace policies and practices in place. But I think that's a way that we're looking at about how we could support female members so that they know that there's somebody trusted within their union that they can turn to in their workplace, who will provide a non-judgmental ear and who won't be there to push them into taking any action they don't want to take, but will be there just to listen, to provide compassion, to provide no judgment, but a safe place that might then signpost them on to specialist support services. Zita, I know that you sort of said you wanted to cover the question in particular about Black women, and I think that I talked about them earlier within my presentation, but happy to go back over anything if anyone wants me to. In terms of how will women who are experiencing the menopause, how will they be supported? Under the equality law, if menopause is having an adverse effect on an employee's ability to carry out the role, then their employer is responsible for addressing those issues and supporting that member of staff. If they were not to support that member of staff who was experiencing difficulties related to the menopause, whether that was in a COVID context or not, and they were to lose their job or be subject to a disciplinary, actually that amounts to discrimination under Equality Act law. So it's really important that employers have a menopause workplace policy and that they're making sure their line managers are trained in how to support workers experiencing the menopause, as I say, whether it's in the COVID context or not. In terms of pregnancy and maternity, again, under equality law, pregnant women and those on maternity leave have protections. So an employer must check that the redundancy is genuine and necessary. They must ensure they consult with that pregnant woman or the new mum on maternity leave, keep them in touch. They must use redundancy selection criteria that is transparent and does not discriminate. And they must consider alternative work. And pregnant women and those mums on maternity leave actually have a right to first refusal. If they are made redundant, they have the right to be offered the first available, most suitable job.
And so, yeah, lots of protections there, but the Maria Miller bill will extend that remit and strengthen that protection to 6 months after a mum returns from maternity leave, which at current, the protection you have only covers you until the end of your maternity leave. Is it dangerous? Is COVID-19 dangerous for pregnant women? The advice on this is still unclear. The evidence and research is constantly emerging all of the time. But what we know in terms of Health and Safety Regulations Act 1999 is that pregnant women, if there is a greater risk to them going out to work than them remaining home, then they have a right under the health and safety regulations to be suspended on full pay based on their usual earnings. And it is our position that at the moment, with the research so unclear about what the impact on pregnant women and their unborn babies is, that women have that right to be suspended on full pay. And many of our unions have been winning that across workplaces for pregnant women. And if women are experiencing difficulties, having that right to be suspended on full pay, if their employer won't temporarily adjust their workplace conditions, remove the risk or allow them to work from home, then we'd really encourage women to share that with their unions and for us to hear that too, because we need to collect these case studies of where employers are flouting the law, just like we did in our pregnant and precarious research.
Thank you very much, Sian. I've realised before I bring Fran in, I did say if anybody had any related questions they'd like to ask them, so apologies. I know there's been some questions in the chat. Did anybody want to ask a question out loud? You could just wave, or you can use the indicators. No, can't see anybody. Okay. Fran, did you want to come back on that set of questions?
Yes, if that's okay. I mean, I won't take up much time because, to be honest, Sian, I find it fascinating listening to what you just outlined, and I think with these calls, you always end up learning something, don't you? And I think some of the information you've just given is really, really valuable. And I echo the people that are saying in the chat, can we get an email out that shares all the links to the various campaigns and things that have been talked about here, because there's some really important stuff that's been discussed. In relation to specifics, I mean, I don't think there's a huge amount I can add to what Sian said, but it is probably worth just covering PCS's position. In respect to domestic violence and domestic abuse, I think our position, we're very lucky, I think, in PCS to have a really effective equality team, and I'd echo Sian's thanks to the people that have run this tonight. And we should make sure the best way to, in my view, to address some of this is education, getting information out there, making sure that information is ready available. So if you've got issues or concerns about any of the things that have been discussed tonight, do drop us an email, either myself or the Equality Department, and we will seek to pick up on all of this. So I mean, the question around domestic abuse, but in particular affecting cis and transgender members, again, often it's a question of education. It's a question of making sure the information is out there and making sure that people feel confident to ask what they don't know, because sometimes people feel a little bit put off raising some of these concerns because they're not familiar with the issues. And I think we have a job in terms of education, in terms of sharing good practice, and in terms of where departments are able to negotiate good policies around domestic violence, that we share and publicise those. I think the points around pregnancy and around menopause, hopefully Sian has answered. I want to say a little bit about our Dying for Sick Pay campaign, because as Zita said, it's really significant that the CS in PCS is the commercial sector, those people that would have been civil servants but have had their work outsourced or privatised over the years. And often these are people cleaning our offices, they're people doing the mail opening. Some of our lowest paid members, often women, often with care and responsibilities, and often with the poorest terms and conditions and policies to protect them. They're the people that have been asked to come in throughout the pandemic and clean offices without any guarantees around safety. And so the work that we've been doing to try and make sure, A, that the 5 tests are implemented in terms of return to the workplace, but B, in the case of our outsourced workers, that where we've made temporary gains during the pandemic for them in relation to sick pay and other terms and conditions issues, that we're able to extend those. And clearly some of these companies bid for the contracts on the lowest possible terms and conditions, and they don't have a lot of protection. And what we're seeking to do is get them firstly into the union, but then to negotiate to try and get recognition with some of these companies, and to make sure that we are pursuing the issues around sick pay to make that a permanent change for the good. And I just really want to finish, Zita, on the BAME risk assessment that was negotiated in the DWP, because obviously that's fantastic and it's something that we should be able to use to put in terms of leverage on other government departments around all of that. But like with a number of these things, the proof of the pudding is how it's then implemented. And what we're seeing is that Black and ethnic minority members are being put off going through, pursuing the risk assessment because it's either not sent to them, it's not publicised, or they're discouraged from completing it. And our advice to all of our members is to make use of this risk assessment, because the idea behind it is to protect your health and safety. And clearly health and safety is a massive issue throughout the pandemic. We've got lots and lots of new reps trained in health and safety, people that are interested in getting more involved, but we need, where policies have been negotiated, such as the one that's been negotiated in the DWP, we need to make sure that it's pursued, that our reps are publicising it, and that our members are utilising it to ensure that the protections that it gives are used, and they can only be used when when people take up the offer of the risk assessment that's been negotiated. So we recognise that there have been some local managers that have been less than encouraging in terms of completion of that risk assessment, but we think it's really essential that people make use of it, and then we can obviously extend the protections across other parts of the union. So thanks very much, Zita, and I hope that that's covered. We will, somebody's just put in the chat, can we share the information around the DWP BAME risk assessment, and I'm sure we can get a link to that, and if that isn't available during the course of the call, I'll make sure that we get something to the ecology department that they can then share with everybody on the call. So thanks very much for that, Zita.
Thank you very much for those responses. We are fast running out of time, and got little time to come back with another set of questions. But what I'd like to do, there's been quite a lot of useful comments and questions saying that it would be good to have case studies. The policy documents are great, but we need case studies. I was about to answer the question of the DWP risk assessment. But you've answered that, Fran. And we were due to have another meeting on this with the Cabinet Office this week, but they've just come back to us to say they have to postpone because of availability, which is really disappointing. And we've expressed to them that this is such an important issue, that it is disappointing that they're saying now that they won't be able to come back to it until September, because it's an urgent issue. So we've asked them to set out everything in writing to us of where they are so far, thus far. But that it come through in advance. So I'm just going to read 3 questions to health and safety. I might be able to give you 1 minute each, whether you can do justice to them, but one is a broader question about going forward, and then we'll have to sum up. But what we'll do is, if there's anything else that's come through the chat or that we haven't answered from the advanced questions, which is these final 3, we'll aim to respond and put something out after the event. So the next 2 are on health and safety. What protection is being offered members working from home in terms of health and safety, e.g. PAT testing electrical equipment? what happens if someone falls at home? Are they covered by employer's liability and personal injury or own home insurance? And the final question, which takes us forward really, is how can more women get involved to address issues being faced in the workplace? So, you know, on that final one, I'm going to come in and say a quick couple of words and then bring Fran and Sian in. Well, people can be advocates, they can become involved as reps. There are lots of online things that we're doing now that people can be involved in. Just being a link to the members that you work with in your own team and your colleagues between the unions, sharing the information you receive, encouraging people to join. You know, we are in a different world because we're not doing things physically, but what we're finding is there's a lot we can do virtually that we didn't have access to, you know, to connect in different ways in the meantime. So Fran, do you want to come back on those kind of
Yeah,
questions?
I mean, to be honest with you, Zita, in terms of the PAT question, testing question, I don't really know the answer, and my guess is if the person that asked it would like to put that into an email and send that in to us, I'll pursue that and see if I can get an answer. And unless obviously Sian has something from the TUC's perspective, it would be useful when if you email in, if you say which department you're in, because clearly we can pursue that for you. In terms of the falls at home and whether or not people are covered by insurance, that's very much an issue I would suggest for departments, but again, it would be helpful, I think, to know if you could put some detail into your email in terms of what that is and send it to me. I will pursue an answer for you. I can't answer either of those off the top of my head, but I just echo in closing Zita's points that there are so many opportunities at the moment for people to get involved in PCS, and we're not asking for big commitments here. We are looking at different ways that people can play a part, be that virtually, be that just talking to the people that you work with and on your team. It really is, the more people we have involved in some small way, the stronger and the better we'll be. And I would end with that really, Zita. And as I say, if there are specifics that haven't been answered that people want an answer to, by all means drop me a line and I'll make sure that I pursue those on your behalf. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fran. Sian, you've got 1 minute.
Well,
sorry about that.
Okay, to address the health and safety questions, they really need to be responded to by a health and safety officer. So I sent them earlier on to our health and safety policy officer at the TUC, and as soon as I get an answer to them, I will forward that to you, Zita, Diane, so that you can pass that back on. In terms of how can more women get involved, well, this is a great example. I was a single mum with a young child, and I could never get to meetings, and actually things being online, I was a single mum living in poverty, the cost of finding someone to look after my child, then the cost of getting somewhere. I think from PCS, this is a really great way, and actually we should keep going, running things virtually, because it opens it up to so many more women. I would also encourage everybody to try and attend the TUC Women's Annual Conference, because you will meet so many other sisters, you will hear amazing debate, you can get up and tell us what you think, what the key issues are for you, and become part of that through your branch network. And then finally, this year's TUC Congress, for the first time ever, is going to be held over 2 days between the 14th and 15th of September. And the equality debates are going to be public for the first time ever. They're going to be held virtually. Anybody can join. I will send the invitation to Diane. But again, it's another way to be part of the conversation, to meet other people, to hear about campaigns and policies, and to make sure your voice is heard. Because we are a women-led movement in terms of our membership is we are more women than there are men, but we need to get more women all the way through, leading our movement and making sure that our voices and our needs are heard and met.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, this brings us to a close. I can see there's some more questions coming through. Just quickly on the point about the timing of the meeting and whether it's good for young children, the National Women's Forum had a discussion about this. We couldn't conclude that there was any ideal time because, of course, children of different ages go to bed different times, and we thought the later it got, the worse it would be. But we also wanted to allow time for people to finish work, because some people are physically going to workplaces. So we will feed all of these comments that have come through back to the National Women's Forum and consider that for future meetings. There's a question come up about, can anyone attend the TUC Women's Conference? TUC Women's Conference was in March. Sian was talking about TUC Congress, and yes, for the first time, any activist, trade union activist, can register and attend that event, and we've started circulating in PCS some details about that now. So yes, we can give you details of that. I'd like to end by thanking everybody, and thank you in particular, all the participants, for giving up your time and coming, for all your really useful comments that you've put into the chat, the questions that were sent in advance. To Fran and Sian in particular for coming and answering questions and for their fantastic contributions, to my fantastic colleagues in the Equality Department that have worked behind the scenes and all through the evening to make this event happen, in particular Diane, Caroline and Melissa, to our interpreter Richard, who's been with us at a number of events now. Thank you so much, Richard, and wishing you all a really fantastic evening. Just to remind you that we are recording this, or we've been recording it. It will be up on YouTube, and for all of you that registered to attend, you'll be sent the link to that when it's up on YouTube, so you can watch it again or share it with others. And if you have any further questions at all, please send those questions to equality@pcs.org.uk, and then that will be fielded to the appropriate people to answer. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's much appreciated, and hope you can still enjoy, if you haven't got thunderstorms, some nice weather out there, even though the sun has now set. Thank you, everybody. Take care of yourselves, and hope to see you soon, be it in the virtual world for the time being.